So it's great to be at Build. There's lots of motivational speakers, and so far you've mostly been hearing about the positive side of things. So I thought it's nice to have a little counterpoint, talk about the apocalypse and how we might all gonna die. But there is a point to this. I don't want to get you all down. It's to motivate us to change the way we think. So in this talk, I'll do what I always do. I'm a paleoclimatologist, so I like to think about how climate changes on timescales of decades to millennia. In other words, timescales that we as humans have a really hard time connecting with because it's so outside the sphere of our immediate experience. So we'll do a little bit of history. We'll go through ages and see how droughts in particular have affected past civilizations. And that will give us an interesting mirror to analyze how they're affecting us right now and how they might affect us in the future and what we can do about them. So you guys all ready? Let's go. So, let's just go straight to the apocalypse. So this is an ancient civilization, Akkad. It's obviously a digital reconstruction of what their main city looked at like at its peak. And it's a civilization that flourished. Interesting, okay. That flourished about 4,000 years ago, so about 2300 BC. They exhibited a lot of very elaborate traits, given how old it is. So first of all, they lived roughly in the modern-day Iraq and Syria, where droughts still have an impact on things. They had an elaborate society. There was a hierarchical structure, very organized. They had the ability to store grain, even some forms of irrigation, and flourishing arts. And they prospered for something like 200 years and then collapsed very abruptly as far as archaeologists can tell. And the question is why? Well, you probably have some idea why. Yes, a drought, that's what it was. And so how do we know there was a drought then? Well, we can go get some sediment cores out in the Gulf of Oman, and we can see that right around 4,000 years ago, the composition of the sediment changes very rapidly in a way that's consistent with essentially a change in the delivery system of sediment to the core. Meaning, in other words, the whole river systems around there have dried up. We don't know exactly why. It's probably related to regional climate changes. But the point is that the climate system is able to do this. It's able to have these abrupt regime shifts where all of a sudden a region that was already fairly dry, but you could still farm in, all of a sudden goes so dry that you can't farm into. And archaeologists have found evidence for a rapid collapse of all social structures around that time. So, food prices go up because of water scarcity, trade collapses, a lot of the major cities essentially empty out, a refugee crisis, people moving to other areas to find reliable water supplies, bringing them in conflict with the people who live there, of course. And that story is as old as the world, right? It's been going on forever and it still happens today. And I'll get back to that, to modern day Syria. Another example that we can analyze from the past and on this continent is the Anasazi. So the Anasazi Indian lived in the Four Corner States, and their civilization started about 600 years ago, prospered for about 600 years, 600 AD, prospered for about 600 years, and then abruptly disappeared between about 1150 and 1200 AD. And now the region, as you know already, this is a pretty dry place. But it turns out that around that time it was even drier. Nevertheless, the Anasazi learned to live with those conditions, and they built some of the tallest and most elaborate buildings in pre-Columbian North America. So they were also a very advanced society. They had the ability to store grain, some for maybe up to 2 to 3 years. They relied mostly actually on corn, on the so-called three sisters, so corns, beans, and squash for their food. And we know that in modern day they can only store corn for something like 2 or 3 years before it becomes too rotten or infested to eat. So we know that a drought that exceeded 3 years would have been fatal to them. And this is where it's important to have a long-term perspective on climate change. So this graph here shows some representation of drought conditions over the past 1,200 years. And essentially you're looking at the fraction of the American West that's in drought conditions by some criterion. And what you see here, so the long-term average is at this line, so about 40% or so of the American West is in a chronic state of drought at all times. but that fluctuates over time. This we know, by the way, from tree rings, if you want the details. Now, this box here represents the 20th century. And as you see, so on this side means wetter, on ups means drier. So California and much of the American West got populated at a time that in a long-term context is actually fairly wet. So when settlers got here, they thought, wow, life is pretty awesome here, the weather's beautiful, and it rains enough to farm, you know, that's great. But in fact, it hasn't always been this way. At the beginning of the millennium, average conditions were drier, and then these conditions were punctuated by a few extreme mega droughts, as we call them. So what characterizes a mega drought is not so much how dry it gets, it's just how long it lasts. So think the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, but lasting not for 8 years, but 30 years. And the Dust Bowl would have probably been bad enough for these people, but another problem befell them, which is that their population got too big. The population started booming sometime in the early 1100s. And so whereas they had been able to withstand a lot of these earlier droughts, they weren't able to withstand this one. And in fact, we have very precise evidence that the last construction happened at Chaco Canyon around here, and then they quickly collapsed after that. And the collapse really wasn't pretty. There's evidence that they started eating small game, then they moved on to rats, and then to each other. So there's evidence of cannibalism. And we can argue about it, whether it was a cultural trait, but I'm going to make the assertion that when people get angry enough, no matter where they're from and what their beliefs are, they will start eating each other. That's just human nature. So how's that for apocalypse? Okay, so let's go to modern day. Okay, so what's the emerging pattern from this? How much time do I have, by the way? Oh, okay, nobody's keeping track. That's great, I'll keep talking. So, from this and other collapses, which summarized in this book. Okay, thank you. There's an emerging pattern, which is that there's many civilizations that have lived and died throughout the world, and most of them did not collapse because of climate. Okay, but the ones that did, it looked like climate is often the straw that broke the camel back. That society had problems to begin with, and climate just pushed it to the brink. Kind of like if you have a rocky marriage and if you go to IKEA together, Now, one thing is that prolonged drought will essentially end any society, right? No matter how well prepared they are, it has, at least so far, doomed any society. And so, of course, we're very arrogant. We think we have all this incredible technology and infrastructure and we can withstand the worst of droughts. But look at how the politics in California have already shifted because of the 5-year drought. And imagine if that lasts for another 30 years, 40 years, like the droughts of the 1100s, which were natural, right? They didn't have anything to do with anthropogenic global warming or anything. This was just the climate system oscillating around and creating those shifts. Now, imagine if that happened today. Well, it may actually be happening today. That's where I'm going. Now, one thing that's really, one of the lessons that we get from studying the collapse of past civilizations is that regardless of the causes of the collapse, one thing that's always incredibly important is the attitude of that society with regard to the changes. And in particular, the successful ones, the ones that were able to face a challenge and overcome it and survive, were the societies that were able to confront their belief system and, if necessary, change them. And there are many examples of that. So, back to us. We are now at a reckoning point with regard to climate change. There are many water-scarce regions with growing populations, including our own, but in other places in the world. And the question is our civilization, because of technology in particular, that much more resilient than the Anasazi or the Akkadians? Well, I'm argued that no, at least not in Syria. So you're all aware of the terrible devastation in Syria. You're all aware of the civil war there that's sort of paved the way for takeover by ISIS. You're well aware, I'm sure, of that ISIS is exporting terrorism all the way to Western Europe. This is taken about 200 meters from where my best friend lives in Paris, and this is after the November 13th attacks. But what you may not know in this whole chain of consequences is that a drought, a multi-year drought that started in 2010, was one of the big factors that really pushed the country to civil war. Again, rising food prices, people moving, some exodus from
farms to cities, putting pressures on these cities, and then essentially that was a powder keg that was waiting to explode. That powder keg of racial and religious tensions, the drought was just essentially the match to set off that powder keg. So once again, climate igniting a pre-existing crisis. So why is this a problem? Well, we have reasons to believe, and these are projections from climate models for the end of the century, if we do nothing to address climate change, that drought conditions are going to become worse all over the world for a big fraction of the planet. So some areas, like the blue areas here, are going to get wetter, but much of the brown areas are going to get drier, and they're going to get, about shit-colored brown in a lot of places. Okay, so that's a big issue that we have to deal with. And so what are the belief systems that we hold that currently paralyze us from acting on climate change? That's very well studied in this beautiful book. I have one example. So if somebody, the first person to ask a question will get an example of the book, or a copy of the book. This is, so climate scientists spend their time trying to ring the alarm bells, tell people, guys, there's a collapse coming. We're all about to die. And people are like, whatever, give me another glass of wine. Nobody gives a shit, essentially. And I found that with my students, too. But one thing that really gets people interested is if you somehow look at it from the perspective of a historian, several hundred years in the future, looking back at our current time and asking the question, what the fuck were they thinking? They had all the scientific knowledge to know what was coming to them, and they did precisely nothing. What was paralyzing them? And this is what this semi-fictional piece does. It's called The Collapse of Western Civilization. So it takes the point of view of people, essentially the tercenary, so at the end of the 2300s, looking back to to the tercenary of Western culture, and addressing that very thing, like how could the children of the Enlightenment that had built their civilization on reason instead of faith fail to act on robust scientific information? And they attribute that to two inhibiting ideologies, positivism and what they call market fundamentalism. So let me talk about that for a bit. What is market fundamentalism? It's the belief that unfettered, completely unregulated markets always reach optimal outcomes. And there's a second side to that fallacy, which is that they are the only way of doing so. So first of all, free markets are an illusion, right? Markets are not and never entirely free. And if they are, we will see what it does, right? If the SEC doesn't have enough power, well, you end up with something like the financial crisis. Or there are all sorts of distortions that means that the markets are never actually reaching optimal outcomes. And if they do, it's not clear that it's actually the only way of doing that. Now, so this is what Margaret Thatcher meant by there is no alternative. Right? After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became clear that communism was not a viable system, and so a lot of people became convinced that capitalism, and especially the more extreme strands of capitalism exemplified by Ronald Reagan, Milton Friedman, or Margaret Thatcher, were the only way to go forward. And that's where we are right now, right? That's where you have an obstructionist Congress that does not want to pass any kind of regulation to address the market failure that is climate change. And yes, climate change is a market failure. There's all kinds of market failures. You can look at, on one hand, this sort of godlike idealization of the market in the words of Adam Smith, the invisible hand, that in that free market ideology very much serves as a substitute for God, right? The market is imbued with these godly qualities, and somehow it's supposed to fix all the problems. Actually, it's not. It's creating a lot of problems. And the reason is not because of the market itself, is because we're not telling the markets what are the costs of things like climate change. What are the costs of economic inequality? What are the costs of globalization? So this comes to the time of reevaluating our beliefs, right? We have a number of beliefs that, well, first of all, the first two we can cross out pretty easily, right? Science can do that for us. Then this belief number two that, okay, maybe it's going to go to shit everywhere, but at least us, the rich people, we're managed to pull through. And I think, the November 13th attacks in Paris should remind everyone that terrorism can export all kinds of problems globally very easily, and there is no insulating ourselves from a global crisis, especially when that crisis affects us, right? So in California, we are right in the middle of it. Technology can save us. I can talk about this a little bit later. I think it is a fallacy. Technology alone cannot save us unless it's coupled with smart policy. And then finally, that belief that the free market is optimal. The free market is the problem. But how this is another side of Milton Friedman that you may not know. He said, it's nice to elect the people, but that's not the way you solve things. The way you solve things by making it politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right things. And I think that that's actually the best justification for carbon pricing. If you built it into the market that you have to do something about climate change or other externalities that are normally not priced by the market, then that's how you incentivize positive social change. So Milton Friedman was a raging hippie. Okay, so I come to the end of my talk. Thank you for being patient so far. Naomi Klein calls climate change a civilizational wake-up call because she says that that's actually at no other time has capitalism, and in particular free market fundamentalism, faced such a slap in the face in terms of being hit by real data that it's just not working. Okay, we're getting a real signal from nature, a real feedback loop that free market fundamentalism is not working on its own. Now, does that mean we have to throw capitalism out of the window? No, the markets are great. Markets have always existed. Humans have traded for thousands of years. Markets can do great things. They just have to be given the proper signals and the proper reins. So here's another belief for you that I'd like to leave you with, is that climate change could save capitalism from eating itself. And by doing that, we can re-engineer markets to serve people and the planet, and not the other way around. Right now, we have people on the planet serving the god of capitalism, the invisible hand. But we can have the invisible hand serve us if we build smarter markets. So climate change gives us a hard and completely non-ideological deadline to do that. So it's time to cast away ideology and start acting on evidence. Thank you.
Thank you for the great talk. So, yes, to everything you said, that's true. And sure, you can maybe modulate capitalism to work in a way that solves this problem. But what do you do with self-prophesizing religiosity that you see in advanced countries like US? What if this is mandated from divine? Why would you intervene with trying to fix this problem? Because we're waiting for the second coming.
Right. So I think actually, you're referring to the fact that a lot of opposition to acting on climate change comes from the evangelical community, right? And I think they're changing their tune about that quite a bit. And first of all, you have Christian leaders like Pope Francis who have taken very outward position on doing something about climate change. And I think slowly the evangelical community is starting to think that, wait, if God created the earth for you, as Louis C.K. said once, and why would you not take care of it? And I think that idea of stewardship of the earth actually is resonating with a lot of evangelical communities. So I think that community is changing fairly slowly, but it needs climate brokers. One of the reasons why the message wasn't getting through is that it's coming mainly from people like me who are raging liberals, French people, scientists, like people that they hate. But if it comes from one of their own, then that message has a chance to come through. And there are now actually people, born in Texas in the evangelical community who believe in climate change. And those are the people who can get the message across.
So would you advocate that scientists should reach out to all religious people and say, hey, join our force and we will accept your, whatever the story might be,
to
promote our own cause?
It's about recognizing we have a lot more in common than we have that separates us. Okay, so maybe we're using different languages, different frames of mind, but we're coming to the same realization that you can't treat the earth as a wastebasket, and that's common sense, right? And that's actually in the Bible if you read it the right way, or other religious texts.
You notice in your graph with the shit brown.
Yeah. You want me to go back to that?
Oh no, that's okay.
Okay.
It showed that there was going to be abundant rainfall, presumably in some regions, and with respect to Southern California, it seemed the prospect of carrying water from which wasn't so very far away, that would that suggest that technology may set us apart from earlier situations, earlier collapses?
Certainly. We can send people to the moon. We could carry water from Canada or Washington State to California. The question is, what's the cost of that? And once again, if you put the cost of carbon in the market, it will very rapidly tell you, okay, yes, you could build a bridge to the moon, but it's going to cost you, more than all the resources we have on Earth. Or you can stop emitting greenhouse gases and avoid these outcomes in the first place. And I think you can let the markets do that by building a price of carbon in them.
Well, to carry it further, then, that would suggest that the carbon buildup has resulted in the drought, but you show in your earlier graph that this has been a regular cycle throughout history, long before industrialization took place.
Yeah, very good question. So there have always been droughts and there will always be droughts. One question to grapple with is, are we contributing to the droughts in a meaningful way? And climate models say yes. So it's just like when you throw a dice, a fair dice, you get a 1 over 6 chance of getting any number. But if you throw a loaded dice, certain outcomes are going to be preferred. That's what we're doing with the climate system. By putting more CO2 into the atmosphere, we're making it more likely for certain outcomes to happen. Both in terms of how much it rains, but actually one of the big drivers of the current drought, for example, if you look at how much it's rained, it's been drier before. There have been less precipitation before than the current drought. What's unique in the current drought is just how hot it has been, and therefore it's been sucking up moisture out of the ground. And so it's this interplay between the two. Climate change is acting much more on the sink of moisture from the soil by making it hotter, rather than the delivery of moisture. And so that's what's different. So you're absolutely correct. There have always been fluctuations in climate, but right now we're changing climate in a way that's favoring those dry outcomes, even when it rains. You want me to repeat it? Yes. Well, what's different this time? So, anthropogenic climate change is a different type of forcing that we haven't seen in probably millions of years, right? The levels of CO2 that are currently in the atmosphere have not been seen on Earth for thousands of years. And they're pushing the climate system in a different way than where it was oscillating before. So you have a system that is prone to oscillations that can be fairly abrupt, and all of a sudden you're taking it in a different way than it wants to go normally. So it's favoring those dry outcomes, even when you have, somewhat on the background of a system that's oscillating, you're sort of pushing it in a different direction. Does that make sense? You're not convinced. We can talk about it later.
How close
Are we eating somebody else's time,
I have a
or?
question.
Okay, good.
How close are we to the tipping point?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? Is there a tipping point? How close are we to it? I think it depends entirely on how you define the tipping point. From a societal perspective, from an ecosystems perspective. How close are we to Mad Max? I think if you study past civilization, you realize that the tipping point can be crossed very abruptly, right? It's very hard to say, but my answer to that is let's not try and get too close to it. I mean, yeah, it's very hard to tell, and societal change can happen so abruptly, as we've seen in Syria, for example. Like that whole situation went in the dumps in no time, right? So, is that something we want to do? Like, could this happen in California? I don't know. I was living in Georgia in 2007 when there was a drought was starting to affect the state, and all of a sudden it started bickering with Tennessee about redefining where the boundary between two states were, because in one definition it would give them access to some water rights or not the other. So we think with the United States of America, but when a crisis like drought happens, not united anymore. There's Georgia, there's Tennessee, they're fighting over things, right? I don't think, right now we're seeing a lot of fight for water resources in California. That we're questioning, well, why are we growing so much alfalfa and other things that we're sending to China? We're essentially exporting the domestic water to China. Why can't China grow its own alfalfa? And why can't we just use the water for other purposes, like Silicon Valley? You see these real questions about water allocations being made. So I think where you place the boundary is pretty arbitrary, but I think we are close to that point where people are beginning to realize that there's going to be tough choices to be made. I don't know if that answers your question.
So I'm a proponent of doing what we can to stop climate change, but I'm also an economist by background. So I think the comment you made about pricing signals is really important. So capitalism works if it has the right information.
Yeah.
And it feels like there are different forces at play that keep that information out of the loop. So consumers don't buy low water use products, foods, but there's an interesting thing in California where I think they were trying to charge a surtax on water usage, and constitutionally they're not allowed to do that. So curious if any discussion has taken place in California to change that type of regulation to prevent premiums to be placed on the price of water.
I'm not a policy specialist. What I can tell you is that perhaps because of how California was populated and this sort of myth of abundant water and sunshine all at the same time, it's not wired into people's brain that they have to save water, right? It's also because California has engineered its water delivery system so well that most people have no idea where their water is coming from, right? We have a city of many millions of people here. You open the tap, and until water stops flowing out of the tap, nobody's going to realize we actually have a water crisis. I see it every day around my neighborhood where you have people just like gushing water all over their lawns. I mean, first of all, we have lawns. That's fucking retarded, right? They ask some people, like, 100 years in the future, what's going to seem most absurd to an observer? What were you going to tell them about the current epoch that they're going to find the most absurd? And I think Michael Pollan said that we had lawns, that we were wasting all these resources on trying to keep alive this dream of the 19th century English garden, because that's one of the beliefs that we had, right? That we essentially are culturally, a descendant of England. But we can't just have roses and lawns and gardens like England did. This is a desert place. Look at the native vegetation, right? So I think doing it through markets and policy is one thing, but we really have to drill it into people's head that this is, we have to reevaluate that belief of what kind of society we are. And if you're in society in a dry place, then you sort of have to do things that are aligned with that. Not having swimming pools and lawns, but perhaps going to the beach and having native vegetation. So I alluded to carbon pricing, and there's actually two main mechanisms to doing that. There's cap and trade and carbon tax. So there is actually a cap and trade system in California and in a lot of Western states. I happen to think it's not as effective as a carbon tax. Of course, tax politically is a four-letter word, so it's much harder to convince people to do it, but it's so much simpler to administer. And I think there has been one in British Columbia that's pretty successful. So essentially the two choices that you have is either you fix the price and you let the market determine the levels of emissions. That's what a tax would do. Or you fix the level of emissions and you issue carbon credits, and that's what cap and trade does. And then the market decides the price. And you can have one or the other. It turns out that if you don't allocate emissions properly, you can be in big trouble. That's what the EU did, and their carbon cap and trade isn't working. And all the states or countries that have passed a carbon tax actually find it a lot easier and a lot more effective. Does that answer your question? You want to know how we could convince people to do it? That's another discussion. Yeah, Ted. We have time for one more.
Yeah.
Is
there a human activity that contributes to global cooling? Seriously, is there something that humans do or a byproduct of human society that has the opposite effect? Not just reducing global warming, but actually cooling.
Well, it's kind of the same. But yes, there is something that we're doing that's actually mitigating the effects of climate change right now. And that's putting air pollution into the air. So some of that pollution, sulfate aerosols in particular, are reflecting sunlight. So without that pollution, it would be in an even browner shit than we are currently. So somewhat counterintuitively, if we clean up the air, it's actually going to make it worse on the point of view of climate change. So that's a conundrum. There are ways to solve that. There's ways to solve types of pollution that are both bad for climate and bad for air pollution, but bad for health, like black carbon. But you're right. I mean, there's been something called global dimming, and that's related to air pollution, and we are doing that. But overall, obviously, the warming part is winning over the dimming part. Okay, thanks a lot for all the awesome questions. It's been great.